Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today is Monday, August 21st, 2023, and we are here in the Larimer County Commissioners Conference Room at our Administrative Services Building in Fort Collins for a work session with our Climate Smart and Future Ready group. And I welcome you all. I'm Larimer County Commissioner Jody Shag-McNally, Chair of the Board of County Commissioners. And joining me today at the dais are my colleagues, Larimer County Commissioner Kristen Stevens and Larimer County Commissioner John Cafalas. Also joining us today is our County Manager, Lorinda Volker, and our Assistant County Manager, Lori Kadrich. And we have some really interesting information to hear about this update, so I am going to turn this over to Heidi Pruess, who is our Climate Smart and Future Ready Program Manager. Okay. So sometimes all these titles, I always think, is it director or manager? Which one is it? So I wanted to just say thank you, and thank you to our guests. I'll let you introduce our guests, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Heidi.
Good morning, Commissioners. Heidi Pruess, Climate Sustainability Manager. I have with me part of our consulting team that has been championing our effort going forward with Climate Smart and Future Ready. They'll provide to you an update this morning, and so I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I'll turn it over to Julia Newman for introductions.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you so much, Commissioners, and to the County Manager for having us here today. We are excited to provide you with an update on the Climate Smart and Future Ready Phase 3 initiative. And my name is Julia Newman. I'm the Managing Director of Communications Engagement at Lotus Engineering and Sustainability. I'm your primary project manager for this project, and I'm joined here today by Josie Plout with the Institute for Built Environment. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Josie.
Good morning, everyone. Josie Plout, Institute for the Built Environment. We're based at Colorado State University, and we're partnering with Lotus Engineering, assisting primarily with the community engagement and working groups for this phase of the Climate Smart Future Ready plan.
Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you being here in your partnership. So I guess I'll let you proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So just wanted to start with an overview for what you can expect to hear about today. We're going to start with just a brief update on our timeline of progress. We've been working on this project since October of 2022, so I want to let you know what's been done so far and what we'll be doing over the coming months with an anticipated finalization of the planning process in April of 2024. So just kind of give you a little bit of a landscape overview there. I'm going to dive into a little bit of detail on the community greenhouse gas inventory emissions results. Heidi has shared with you the operational inventory results in the past, so that this is a different way to slice the pie in terms of looking at emissions. And then we'll talk about the working group efforts, so the work that we're collaborating with IBE on to bring in input from community members and stakeholders across Larimer County, and a little bit about our equity approach and how we're going to be analyzing equity opportunities and potential equity on unintended consequences of this work. Finally, I'll share with you the next steps, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions to answer what I predict will be quite a few questions about the work that we're doing, and give you more clarity on that. So with that, we'll dive right in. So for the first half of 2023, we did work with working groups to determine the priority needs, the gaps, and the synergies to build off of in terms of the Climate Smart and Future Ready Phase 3 planning process. So as you all are aware, there were two prior phases of Climate Smart and Future Ready that helped to inform this work. So when we started this project in October, we had an initial list of opportunities, of priorities, of things that the community wanted to see worked on, as well as things that internal staff had determined could be priorities of this work. So our work with Phase 3 is really focusing on finalizing those strategies and actions, making sure that we have the right work set out for the community, and understanding how that work is going to be done. So in July, we did finalize that draft list of focus area strategies and actions. I do anticipate that draft list will change a little bit as we go through our coming conversations over the next couple of months. But what's happening now is between now and October, we'll be meeting with implementation focus groups. So these are members of the working groups that have been participating in this project since the end of last year, as well as additional organizations that might want to be involved in the implementation of these strategies and actions to understand who is responsible for this work? How is it going to get done? When are we going to do this? What are the different components that we need to consider? What are the funding sources? What are the those equity unintended consequences or equity opportunities to enhance quality of life throughout the community? Those will be the conversations that we're having with focus groups over the next couple of months. In September, we're also going to do some specific conversations with community-based organizations to dive in a little bit more on some of those unintended consequences and opportunities to enhance equity. And then by the end of quarter 4, 2023, we will have the final list of strategies and actions as well as the details on how those will be implemented. And then moving into the beginning of next year, we will finalize the plan components and deliver that draft update to a plan to the community. And then in Q2 in April, as I mentioned, is when we'll be finalizing the CSFR plan itself. So in terms of the work that the tools that we've been using to inform this work, we're taking a couple of different approaches and really utilizing all of the data and information that we can collect and have at our disposal to make sure that this is the right plan for Larimer County. So obviously we're doing this working group effort, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but gathering input from stakeholders and experts in the community, people who are doing this work, people who want to see this work done, who are involved in this work. And involving them in the process. We did a thorough review of existing plans, both at the local, the regional, and the statewide level to make sure that what Larimer is doing is really in line with both your neighbors locally and regionally, as well as the work that the state is doing. And I'll note that the state is always coming out with new programs and new plans, so we continue to make sure that we're checking back and keeping in alignment with all of that. And then there are 3 different greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So Heidi did share with you the results of the operational inventory that looked at the emissions that are created specifically through Larimer County government operations. What I'm going to share with you today is the community greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So that's another way, again, to slice the pie that looks at emissions that are produced across Larimer County due to activities that take place in Larimer County. So some of those emissions occur within the boundaries of the county, such as the transportation emissions that happen on roads in Larimer County. Others are induced by activity in Larimer County, such as the consumption of electricity, regardless of where that electricity is produced. And then we are doing one additional greenhouse gas emissions inventory effort. It's called a consumption-based inventory. And that one will look at what are the emissions that are caused by activities, goods, and services specifically that are consumed within Larimer County. So each of these provide a little bit of a different way to look at the data, and in doing so, they provide a different view on how we should make policy decisions on reducing greenhouse gas emissions caused by activities in Larimer County. While they're each fantastic tools, they are not tools that can be added together, so we wouldn't take all 3 of those inventories and come up with one lump sum total, because there would be double counting across those inventories. The operational inventory includes, for example, energy that is consumed in Larimer County's government buildings. Those emissions are also included in the community-based inventory. So we don't want to add all of 3 inventories together, but they are each a separate tool that really helps us understand the policies that can drive emissions reductions in Larimer County. So just wanted to kind of set the stage there with that. The approach that we used for the community-wide inventory is that we used a protocol called the GHG Protocol for Cities. It's got actually a much longer official name, so we call it the GPC for short. That's our framework. That is a globally accepted standard used by communities across the world to analyze their greenhouse gas emissions that happen within their community. So as we started to develop this, we met with individual communities throughout Larimer County to really understand what are the relevant and applicable sources of emissions that need to be included. And then understanding that, we started to compile our data contacts. We reached out to those contacts to collect the relevant data. We do multiple rounds of QA, QC, quality assurance, and quality control as we're doing inventory. So that first round happens when we get data in. If we have questions about the data, if we think it looks a little bit fuzzy, if we're not sure about some of the data sources, then we go back and we continue to request more information until we feel really certain that we've got the most relevant and defensible data that we're using in the inventory. And then we start to plug that data into our inventory workbook, which is a customized Excel spreadsheet. We use an Excel spreadsheet so that it's something that Heidi and her team could use in the future to replicate this inventory easily. And then we, again, go through more rounds of QA/QC at that point to make sure that all of the data has been input correctly, that we are still using the most current global warming potentials and emissions factors and other data that needs to go into the calculations for ultimate emissions. And then we did a benchmarking process. So we looked at comparing Larimer County to other communities locally and other counties that have done similar greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So you can kind of see where you stand in those comparison rankings. And then we finalized the inventory, and we did present it to the working groups in July so that they have received this information as well. So this slide shows the total emissions for Larimer County in 2022, and we've broken that down by municipality in Larimer County. So as you see, we've listed these actually by the percent of total emissions. So Fort Collins, being the largest population center in Larimer County, is also the largest, the most emissions come from that community, followed by unincorporated Larimer County, and then Loveland, Estes Park, Berthoud, and Wellington. Estes Park represents 3% of the county's total emission, 2% of the county's population, but then you can see in the emissions per capita column, the Estes Park emissions per capita are much higher than the rest of the community, and that's really driven by its economy. It's a tourist-based economy, so there are more people traveling there, there's more cars on the road, there's more waste being produced, and that's something that we see as really typical with Colorado mountain communities that have a tourist-based economy. I do want to note that the unincorporated totals include Red Feather Lakes, Timnath, Glenhaven, and Livermore. And we did reach out to other communities, such as those in Johnstown in Larimer County, to invite them to participate in this process. At the time, they weren't able to, or they declined. So their totals are still included in the unincorporated total. They're just not split out by those specific community boundaries. So our total emissions for Larimer County is 4.2 million. And as we start to look at how those break down, then that really helps us to understand, where the emissions are coming from in the community. So the results for Larimer County, I would say, are pretty typical for what we see for Colorado communities and communities nationally. Building energy use does almost always tend to be the largest source of emissions, and that includes the use of fossil gas in buildings, electricity, propane, and other energy sources in buildings. And it's very typical that it does make up the largest portion of emissions. It makes up a little bit more in Larimer County than we see in some other communities, and that might be because of the age of the building stock or just because of the share of emissions that are coming from other sources. Transportation is something that we tend to see taking up about a third of emissions in a community. So in Larimer County, it's a little bit closer to a quarter, so a smaller portion of emissions coming from Larimer County, but that includes your on-road vehicles, so your gasoline and your diesel vehicles. It includes public transit activities, and then if applicable, it includes airports. So the airport that is in Larimer County is included in that total. We did not include any sort of induced travel or induced activity at other regional airports such as Denver International Airport in this inventory, so those are not included there. And then I want to note that industrial processes and product use, we call those IPPU emissions. Those are generated in Larimer County specifically by an electronics manufacturing facility that's in Fort Collins. It should be noted that there are additional sources of IPPU emissions in Larimer County, such as the Rawhide Energy Production Facility. However, those are per the protocol that we use for this inventory, those are reported as information only. So those aren't included in this pie total, but they are included in the workbook so that you can track those emissions. And that's, again, just because of the way that the inventory, the way that the protocol asks you to calculate emissions, we assign those emissions to buildings that are using the energy rather than the facility that is producing the energy. But those emissions, I do want to say, are accounted for elsewhere in other community inventories. So if Rawhide is transporting energy, if energy produced at Rawhide is going to communities outside of Larimer County, when they do an inventory, that would capture that emission. And then the EPA also does capture all of those types of industrial emissions that are happening as well. And then we can start to dive down into sources of emissions, which gives us even more detail on where we have an opportunity to reduce emissions across the community. So as we can see, electricity is the largest emission producing source in Larimer County. Again, that's building energy use, so that's electricity used in buildings and in a very, very small portion coming from electric vehicles as well. And then fossil gas use, so natural gas in buildings, is the second largest sector, followed by on-road gasoline vehicles. So that kind of tells you that our biggest opportunities to reduce emissions in Larimer County come from cleaning up our electricity grid, making sure that the electricity that is coming into homes is generated by clean, renewable resources, and then transitioning as much as possible away from the use of fossil fuels in heating buildings and in powering our vehicles. When we look at a comparison of Larimer County to other communities that have completed similar greenhouse gas emissions inventories, there's a couple of things to note. So first of all, Larimer County's is the most recent inventory. The other communities have not completed or not released their more recent 2022 inventories if they've done that. We are, Lotus, we are completing Denver's inventory, so we're happy to provide that information once that is complete. And then the other one thing that I want to note is that this table is only looking at basic emissions. So the GPC protocol has two different levels at which you can report, and all of these communities did, at the very least, did basic emissions. So here we've only reported Larimer's basic emissions, which is why the total that you're seeing for Larimer in this slide is a little bit different from in an earlier slide. It just doesn't include, basically it doesn't include transmission and distribution losses coming from energy transported across the electric grid. The main thing that I look at when I look at these types of benchmarking is the emissions per capita and the emissions per household. So as we can see, Larimer County is right in line with City and County of Denver in terms of emissions per capita, a little bit higher than than Boulder County on emissions per capita, and then pretty significantly below Santa Fe County, New Mexico, and Dane County, Wisconsin. That's where Madison, Wisconsin is. So it has a blend of agriculture and urban, which is why we selected that as a comparable community. And then on the emissions per household side, we see that Larimer County is tracking actually a little bit higher than other Colorado communities. And this is something that I think is pretty interesting. It's something that I believe might be due to a larger household size in Larimer County, perhaps primarily driven by student populations in Fort Collins. So larger household size, fewer households overall. Yeah.
So if I wait, stop your road.
Please.
It's interesting you mentioned that because that caught my eye. Is that why we also was used because it's got a comparable?
That's correct. Yeah, Madison has I think multiple universities. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but it's sort of like, yeah, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to kind of see that was another reason it was chosen.
Yes. Yeah. You're absolutely right there. And they have a pretty high emissions per household as well as you can see there in relative comparison to other communities. And then I skipped right over Jeffco, I apologize, but theirs is also, they've got a little bit higher than Larimer County in terms of per capita, but again, lower on household. And then I like to break it down as well to look at where emissions are coming from in each of these communities. So again, as we can see, Larimer County is right in line with City and County of Denver and Boulder County in terms of the share of emissions that are coming from building energy versus transportation versus waste. And then the other category is that IPPU as well as wastewater and agriculture emissions. In Jefferson County, they have a much higher proportion of emissions coming from transportation activities. I attribute that to I-70 corridor going right through there, as well as 470 and some major thoroughfares. So that's going to be a main driver there. And then they didn't account for IPPU industrial process emissions. So that's also going to change their proportions coming from different areas a little bit. Santa Fe has a very high burden coming from transportation. And we looked into that because that surprised us a little bit. Their data, they have a really, really high vehicle miles traveled number for the community, and that's one of the main data points that goes into calculating on-road emissions. They did derive their data from Google Analytics data, so we think it's pretty verifiable and trust it, but we were surprised to see that as well. A lot of transportation activity happening there.
It's interesting you bring that up because I'm friends and serve on the National Association of Counties Environment, Energy, and Land Use Steering Committee with the woman commissioner for Santa Fe County, and she's very vocal, and we talked about this.
Oh, really?
And we're looking at maybe bringing forth a resolution to talk about some things going forward, but if you ever want to sit down and talk with her, she's quite the force and fighting for renewable energies and things, but it's something we've talked about is because it is a very touristy area, but there's not a lot of infrastructure even coming out from Albuquerque, and a lot of people travel through there, and there's lots of casinos in that area as well, and people are driving back and forth to the casinos, so just something to think about. It's a changing landscape there with the growth and things. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah, so if you want a connection, I will connect you.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Commissioner Stevens.
Yeah, with so the IPPU is the one that maybe puts us over the top, it looks like, versus some of the other communities? Is that what, I mean?
I don't think it's the IPPU necessarily. Going back to this slide for the total emissions and the emissions per capita and per household, I actually think that in terms of total emissions, you're pretty in line with other communities locally. The building energy sector is what is driving the majority of emissions in Larimer County. So that comes from the use of electricity in buildings and how that electricity is being produced, and then the use of natural gas primarily as a heating fuel.
But, I mean, we're percentage-wise, like in the emissions breakdown chart, I mean, it seems like the city of Denver is still doing more. So, I mean, the fact that our per capita kind of use is higher, right, than Denver, and I don't know.
Yes, yeah. So in this table then for Denver did not report their IPPU emissions here. If they did, then that would change things a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Boulder counties are accounted for here. And that is, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the primary facility in Boulder County where those industrial emissions are coming from is the Chemex cement manufacturing facility in Lyons.
And is it best practice to report it? I mean, is it just that they didn't report it because it was something that hadn't been reported in the past, or is it, I don't know, is it a way to?
Yeah, that's a great
Okay.
question. It really varies by what the community wants to look at and what they feel like is in their control. So some communities will do a full analysis of all of the emissions, which is what we did for Larimer, including the industrial sources. Because there could be a little bit of an opportunity to help a facility maybe green their processes or clean up their energy supply or their manufacturing processes. Other communities might not report that because they don't feel that they have the ability to really make that change, and they want to focus in on the areas of emissions that they have a little bit more control over in terms of things like building codes and incentive programs and things like that. Denver specifically, I will say they report every year, and they actually go through a cycle where I believe it's like every 3 years they do a full inventory that includes those industrial processes. We wanted to use their most recent data from their 2021 inventory, which is not one of those years that they included those industrial processes. So
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I understand why people don't want to include it, and yet it's there anyway. So, I mean, it seems like you could at least have an asterisk or something that says this is not, or, I mean, honestly, putting some pressure on some of these bigger polluters that do industrial work, because, and my guess is that some of them might be held accountable under some of the new ozone regulations as well, because as we go into severe non-attainment, I mean, a lot of this stuff, this is, kind of cross
it will start to affect it. Yeah, absolutely. The and the industrial facilities can have a huge impact. So we didn't include it here because it's not a county, but we recently worked with the City of Commerce City to understand their greenhouse gas emissions inventory profile. a total of 50%, 49% of their emissions come from industrial sources in that community. And some of those are ones that they have a little bit more control over. Others are regulated by the state, and they don't. So I think it's important to have the full picture. I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
Commissioner Kafalis.
Thank you. And thank you, Julie. I have one question related to this slide. I'll ask that now. So with regard to comparing, for example, Larimer and the city and county of Denver as it relates to transportation, the percentages of the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from transportation, would you help further explain why Denver is higher, 30%, compared to Larimer County, given that Denver has a lot of transit options, light rail, buses, and I recognize that there are more people down there, that might be the explanation, but also the per capita greenhouse gas emissions are very similar. And a corollary question to that, if I may, Julie, colleagues, is there a way with these inventories to determine what kind of impact having more multimodal transportation or more transit options, how does that help address, obviously that would less motor vehicles, miles traveled is helpful. Do you follow my two questions, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So Denver, it certainly being a more urban setting has a lot more public transit resources and the light rail and everything like that. However, they do also have, again, the I-70 corridor, the I-25 corridor. They've got the 270 going to 76, and all these different highways. Yep, 470, all these different highways, that anything that's driving, any vehicle that's on those roads is within the city and county's boundaries are going to be attributed to the city and county, whether or not it's someone who lives there or is just has flown into DIA and is then going up to Breckenridge or wherever they might be headed. So that, sorry?
In the airport?
And the airport, yeah, the airport is also, yes, thank you. The airport is also included in here. I believe that this inventory, this one that's reported here, only includes Denver's share of emissions from the induced travel, which means basically the residents that are living in Denver and using Denver Airport. Denver has a separate operational inventory for the airport that looks at like all of the activities at the airport, the ground support vehicles and all of that. So, and then to Commissioner, to your second question on how to understand where there might be an impact of enhanced multimodal activities or things like that. Certainly the main driver for this type of inventory calculation will be reduced vehicle miles traveled on the road, as well as, in addition to VMT, we also look at a lot of other pieces of data that go into these vehicle emission calculations, and that includes the share of vehicles that are gasoline vehicles versus electric vehicle versus diesel vehicles, and then diving down a little bit more within that, what share of vehicles are passenger cars versus pickup trucks versus box trucks like those Amazon delivery vehicles versus big heavy diesel freight trucks and things like that. So we can also start to look at as things like a percentage of people who are using electric vehicles increase. That will also start to drive that down. We can do some additional modeling to look at expected emissions reductions from things like mode shift from single occupancy vehicles to riding your bike or walking or taking transit or things like that. Those things are harder to capture in an inventory, but I think that ultimately when that leads to vehicle miles traveled reduction and changes in the makeup of vehicles on the road in the community, then that's the primary driver there. Yeah. Of course.
So,
Sorry.
Commissioner Kafalis, the other thing I would add to that is land use and the role that that plays. So how complete and connected are communities? How easy is it to access basic services like banking, childcare, dental services, et cetera? And how do we look at that across the county and particularly in unincorporated areas that are still densifying? So what are the ways that we can look at land use in a way that helps people stay in their neighborhood when they want a coffee or to go out or take other basic services in?
Well, and that would be hard to do when, because I live in unincorporated and, I can't imagine putting a whole thing in with sewers and there's not water and, and there's septic systems and that impacts growth in those areas. So I'm always hesitant to say we need to densify in some of those areas because it's a lot of no infrastructure. So my question was, though, I was going to bring up the airport question, but I also wondering, when you think about Denver, they have things like, they had Sharon concert last night, had 80,000 people showing up for a concert, and they have football games, and that brings people, not everyone takes the mass transit because they can't always access that. Hopefully they're maybe connecting sooner before getting downtown, but is that also something you would look at? Because you have football games, you have soccer, and you have ultimate frisbee, all those things, and so I'm wondering what that looks like when you have, 80,000 people driving is an impact for that day, and I'm curious about, I don't know how you could change, and people traveling through those corridors, I don't know how you would impact changing that flow, because people are traveling, interstate-wise, that would be hard to impact. I'm just curious about that as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say in this type of inventory analysis, it's not going to capture the level of detail of the concert last night or the football games or anything like that. But I think it goes back to being able to look at the infrastructure that is developed and supported, and then the policy level decisions that also can help to drive people to use. And when I say infrastructure, I mean things like public transit and accessible bikeways and things like that. The combination of those two things will ultimately, ideally, lead to, again, a reduction in cars on the road. And that's how it would be captured here in emissions inventory analyses. But absolutely, in terms of, informing those policy level decisions, then, looking at, as Josie mentioned, looking at, how do we create those connected neighborhoods, looking at how do we provide more access to maybe things like park and rides that can help people get from a more rural setting to an urban setting, and somewhere in the middle there, drop their car off and get on a bus or get on another vehicle. We've looked at in other communities that we've been working with that are a little bit more mountain-based. We've been looking at how would the deployment of a microtransit system, something that is not too dissimilar to like Uber rideshare, but is more publicly supported. How would that work in helping to get people from, outlying communities to a center where they can then pick up the bus to get to an urban population or their services that they need?
I'm glad you brought that up. That was an interesting conversation and something I'm hoping to get out into experiences. We were hosting Park City and Summit County from Utah, and they have that system. And they were raving about how much of a big difference was that it's that, last mile either way. And so I'd be curious, is that one of the systems you were looking at, or other communities able to implement that kind of program? And
yeah, interestingly, it hasn't come up in direct conversations in the working groups in Larimer County yet. I do think that it's something that could come out of some of these focused conversations as we start to have them on what it really looks like to dive down into these broad strategies and understand what it looks like to implement them. But you mentioned Summit County, Utah. In Summit County, Colorado, we looked at that model in Summit County, Utah. We were working with them on a climate equity plan, and they have a climate action plan, and they have a lot of things like electric vehicle benefits and things like that, but there's a whole segment of the population that is not able to really participate or benefit from this climate action work. And a lot of that is workforce population and immigrant communities and folks who don't speak English as a first language. And in those conversations with those community members and in conversations with the entities, the organizations and governments that were hosting this planning process, the prospect of a microtransit program where people could be able to go on an app and request a ride to get them to the transit stop or to get them to a location where they can pick up other transit or maybe even just get all the way to work through using, ideally, maybe even electric buses or small electric vans or things like that, so that you're also reducing air pollution and greenhouse gases that are coming from those vehicles. So, yeah.
Thank you. I find it was an interesting conversation. It's kind of interesting that they're kind of connecting some of these things. So
Yeah.
I want to just do a quick time check where we're at, since we have about 25 minutes left. I know we're asking a lot of questions, so I want to make sure.
It's fine. I think what I'll do now is I'll hop through the rest of the slides quickly to just let you know kind of what we're doing in terms of those working group conversations and next steps, and then we can have another Q&A session at the end to answer any other
That
questions
sounds great.
come up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so a quick update on working group progress. So there are more than 50 entities and organizations across Larimer County that have participated in the working groups so far. We have 3 working groups: the Built Environment, Circular Economy, and Businesses and Jobs working group that was previously called Built Environment and Economy, Waste and Economy, but we broadened the definitions a little bit. Mobility of People, Goods, and Services, and then Natural Environment, Water, and Agriculture. We started out with an additional working group, the Wellbeing and Resilience Working Group, but after meeting with them a couple times and the other working groups, we realized there was really a lot of benefit to having those members be absorbed into other working groups related to the areas that they work in specifically, so that those wellbeing and resilience components are not lost and they are integrated and fully connected into the strategies and actions of this work. So those 50 entities and organizations do include obviously Larimer County departments, as well as jurisdictions across Larimer County, and nonprofit organizations, agencies, public sector organizations, and some private businesses that are working across the community as well. So it's pretty diverse representation of Larimer County. I believe that you received the current strategies list, so we can talk about that during the Q&A a little bit, but just wanted to let you know that that is something that is our current working strategies and actions list, and that's what we'll be using in implementation conversations as we start to determine how this work is going to roll out over the future. There are 3 primary objectives to the CSFR, and these objectives were developed by working groups and then vetted with the executive committee and the Public Outreach and Education Committee, which are 2 additional separate working groups that we work with. And those objectives are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reliance on non-renewable natural resources, to increase community resiliency and improve the quality of life. To increase community resiliency and the ability to adapt to changes, and then to improve equity and the quality of life in both human populations, human communities, and ecosystems in Larimer County and beyond. And then we did also develop criteria for evaluating the strategies and actions. So I don't anticipate that ultimately we'll have a plan that says priority 1 is this, and priority 2 is this, and priority 3 is this. I think that more so we're going to have a plan that says here's all of the things that need to be done, and here's how they can happen. And through that determination of what the work looks like, there will be some prioritization that sort of falls out in there. However, we do, as we're looking at the strategies and actions, these are the criteria that we're going to be using to evaluate their feasibility to move forward, basically. So do they meet those objectives that we just mentioned? Are they supported by data? Do they fill gaps in existing resources and efforts? Is there community will to implement? That's a really important piece. And then do they create some sort of economic benefit throughout the community? So as I mentioned, between now and October, we'll be doing these focus group conversations to really start to understand what is it really going to look like to get this work done? So the actions are right now being vetted for their level of detail and whether an owner exists. So we appreciate the input of Larimer County and staff in really understanding who in Larimer County could own, within the Larimer County government could own these efforts, as well as who outside of Larimer County might be appropriate to ask if they would like to be owners. Those individuals will then be approached and we'll be talking to them over the coming weeks to say, do you want to be involved? Is this something that you would like to do? And if so, then can we help you to determine what it looks like to get this work done? So we'll be having focus groups to really determine, again, the who, the how, the when of this work. This planning process is really focused on the next 5 years. So much can change in terms of technology development, in terms of the cost of technology, and really the policy space, especially as the state does more and more work in climate action and climate resiliency. So we wanted to really focus on what can happen in the next 5 years, and also have a lens of what might happen in the future beyond that. We understand that ultimately some actions that we've developed with the working groups, that the working groups have identified as important, might not have owners. There might not be anyone at this time to step up and say, I will own this, and this is something that I can move forward. Those actions are still going to appear in the planning process, but they might be more slated for like a future effort of the plan, something that as some of this work is done, then someone else might be able to step forward to own some of these additional actions. So if we reach out to any of you, if we reach out to anyone listening, it is because we would love your involvement in these conversations to help determine those next steps. And again, the county is going to be owning some pieces, as well as external agencies and jurisdictions and entities owning some of the pieces as well. And then these are, they won't necessarily specifically fill out this template here, but we wanted to fit all of the questions that they'll be answering onto one space. So these are the action coordination templates, the acts that focus groups will be asked to fill out in terms of those implementing those actions. So over the coming weeks, they'll be getting their acts together and providing that information back over to us. And then quickly, in terms of understanding the equity impacts and the unintended consequences of this work, we are developing an equity toolkit that will help to vet those unintended consequences and the opportunities to enhance equity in the community. So this is something that has been used by other planning processes. The City of Austin has used this, the City of Seattle. There is a government association on racial equity that has an equity toolkit. So we've adopted some questions from those different toolkits that really help us dive down into how are the different strategies and actions going to improve affordability or impact affordability? How could they impact the urban and rural divide in Larimer County and ensure that there are equitable services and access to services across the community? How are they making sure that people with disabilities are included in this process? So those are the types of questions that we'll be asking through this equity vetting. The focus groups who are determining how these actions are going to be implemented are going to be using this toolkit as part of their process. And then we're also going to have some additional outreach and conversations with other groups and entities in Larimer County using a bit of a distilled down toolkit to make it more accessible to a general audience who doesn't live in this, talking about this work every day. But to help understand, again, what are those unintended consequences and how can we avoid them, and then how can we enhance equity benefits throughout the community as much as possible. So we met with Healthy Larimer Committee last week. It was fantastic to hear from them. We are going to be meeting and working with the EDI board. Heidi has met with the youth engagement specialists. So a lot of advisory boards are going to be included in this process as well. My screen keeps flickering there, so sorry about that. And then just in terms of next steps, we had an original list of 54 actions, which is a lot. So we have whittled it down a bit, quite a bit. And then I do anticipate, as I mentioned at the top, that through this implementation conversation, that there will be a little bit more of probably whittling down that happens, or perhaps actions move under other actions as tactics that help to support them and things like that. So we'll be working with those implementation focus groups to complete get their acts together, complete their action coordination templates. We'll be doing the equity toolkit review, and then we have a second session of informational videos that'll be started on in the coming months. Once we have our final list of strategies and actions, we see these videos as really an opportunity to excite people, excite the whole community about this process, let them know what's happening and how they can get involved. And then we'll have that final report in Q2 of next year. So in the meantime, I've linked our social pinpoint page, which is a public-facing website where there's a couple of different forums and activities that people can do to provide input in this planning process. So we would love your input. And again, if we reach out to anyone, any of you three and anyone listening, then we would certainly appreciate your input and expertise and wisdom into how to continue moving this work forward. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Excellent presentation. I just really appreciate all the data information and how clearly you laid it out. And when we first started this process, I was thinking, wow, how are we going to put our hands around this and get it kind of where we can look at data and kind of see where the clear steps are. So I just want to say thank you to all three of you and being here today. Excellent presentation. I see Commissioner Stevens has her hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. So in the criteria for evaluation, I'm wondering, I think that, excuse me, given kind of some limited budget to implement some of this and knowing that some of the things, like, will we be able to kind of guesstimate kind of how much some of these would cost for the county to, help implement? And then, as far as like criteria, kind of the ones that do the most good for, not necessarily for least amount of money, but the ones that really, really reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus ones that maybe are less, I guess just it would be nice to have sort of a priority listing of what would be really meaningful and impactful as with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and which wouldn't be, just so we can, as we look at implementation, I would love to implement all the strategies and actions, but I mean, I don't know how feasible that is like in the immediate future. And so just wanted to, say like, will we say, will we have something that says we anticipate that if we, let's say, do the sustainable business program, we anticipate this level of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions kind of thing. Will we see those kind of numbers?
Yeah, we we'll certainly apply a high-level estimate there. For this project, we didn't include specific like modeling. We can go into detail. I mentioned like modeling on transitioning from single occupancy vehicles to like riding your bike or taking transit. We didn't scope a really specific model in that way. That's certainly something that we're capable of doing, but we have done a lot of that for other communities. So even without doing a detailed model for Larimer County specifically, then we are able to look at the different strategies and actions and say, we think that this could reduce emissions by somewhere between 1% and 2% versus over 5% versus over 10% in emissions reductions.
Yeah, that's great. And then, I think about some of the work that the MPO's already done around, because we've been having to account for greenhouse gas emissions, because of a state. And like you said, we're going to be looking at these state policies because as a state rolls out policies, maybe we don't have to enact it, or maybe we're forced to, not forced, that's harsh terminology, but maybe we're required to enact some things that the state brings into play too. So, I appreciate the information. It's really good. And I think as we, talk about the community implementing some of the programs, one of the things that we do on the Regional Air Quality Commission is have things like simple steps to better air and kind of ways that to get the buy-in from the community about what they can do, right, to help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So whether it's, taking a ride with someone else or putting solar on their roof or getting an electric vehicle or something like that. I like that because I think that, to get buy-in in the community, it's good. And people want to know what they can do. And not everybody understands kind of what their footprint is and what that looks like and how to change that. So I think anything that we could do that sort of gets folks on board in the way that they can, individual steps that they can take to also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions would be really great.
Absolutely, yeah. And we actually did include as well, alongside the final report that will detail those strategies and actions and how that work is going to be done, we'll have what we're calling a community mobilization appendix. So a document that basically says, here are the, here's kind of the key strategies that you can start to really communicate to the community to empower them and excite them to be involved and participate in this work. So that'll be a part of this as well.
Great. Well, I look forward to the future steps, and I appreciate the work that's been done already, and I think, we're on the right, going in the right direction, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. Commissioner Kofallis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just offer a couple of questions since we don't have a whole lot of time. And one is, I just want to emphasize or reaffirm one of the points that Commissioner Stevens made about resources required to implement the action plan, so that it'll be helpful to have a better understanding of what kind of county resources, community resources, monetary, et cetera, will be necessary. But beyond that, I'm hoping that maybe the next time we get together, we could hear more from our colleagues from the CSU Institute for the Built Environment regarding the role of land use planning, I hope, in the built environment, because that's really important to what we're trying to do. So it'd be great if we could have more discussion with the Institute folks, Josie and her team. My really, a couple of questions here. In the slide overarching objectives and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and use of non-renewable natural resources, et cetera, are we going to have specific measurable objectives in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, targets? I mean, most of the time when I've seen these things, it says this is our baseline, and by 2030 or 2040, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, 20%. So that's one question. Maybe you could respond to that sort of quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to believe that having those types of specific goals is very helpful and useful. Without the modeling, the really specific modeling, then I think it would be difficult to say we know we can achieve this, but that doesn't mean that you can't set a goal, if that makes sense. So, but I would hesitate to make it we've worked with other communities that say we're going to have a 76% reduction, and that's because we've done the modeling to really understand if we implement all of these different strategies and do it in this time frame and have these different factors included, then we have a significant degree of confidence that that's what the emissions reductions will be. So I think that we would maybe want to avoid being too specific in terms of the total reduction, but I do think that there's an opportunity, absolutely, looking at a high level estimate of greenhouse gas reductions, we can make a pretty good estimation of where emissions might be in the next 10 or 20 years based on that.
Thank you. May I just do a little bit more?
Yeah, just looking at the time, want to be mindful.
I'm looking at the time as well. I appreciate that response, Julie. And my hope is that we can include some type of targeted greenhouse gas reductions, that are based on good data and what's realistic, and, the ability to make adjustments when we've seen that maybe our estimates are not coming to fruition. So thank you for that response. Another question I have is I'm intrigued by this idea of ownership, and you identified internal, county organizational owners, and then owners in the community. That seems like a very unique approach. Is that the case? And if so, how did you all come up with that?
I love that question. Something that we've been finding with a lot of, and Josie, I'd love to, and Heidi, let you both respond to this as well. But something that I'll say from my team's end that we've found in working with communities in finalizing these types of broad planning processes is that if it's just a list that doesn't say, and here's how if it doesn't have that implementation approach and that understanding of, this is the entity that is really going to move this work forward and this is who's going to be accountable for it, then often it can just feel like a little bit of a laundry list that is difficult to get started on. So that's something that we integrate in a lot of our planning processes just to make sure that that you have the tools that you need once the plan is finished to really hit the ground running. But I don't know if either one of you wanted to add to that.
Thank you, Commissioner. We began this initiative with the understanding that it's going to take the entire community for us to reduce our impacts and to improve quality of life. That it's not Larimer County's sole goal, frame of work, mission, to take on the actions that are needed for us to be able to not only reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but to have a more positive, sustainable impact in the community. So for instance, many of the strategies and actions you may see in the working draft that we provided to you are around the way in which electricity is provided to our community. We have experts in our community, those electric providers, the utilities within each municipality that are not only actually providing those services, but are in fact the experts in their field, for which it is more logical for them to be able to champion and lead the path for how it is that we can work together as a community. And so that's one example, and knowing that, we kind of developed this framework for the working groups with that in mind, explaining it to them right up
Thank
front.
you, and I appreciate that. My closing comments, affirmations are such that I think this approach is really an excellent one, and there are opportunities for cost sharing, there are opportunities for further buy-in from the community, so I think that's great. Finally, I appreciate the references regarding equity toolkit and process, and specifically calling out things related to affordability, urban-rural divide, and certainly perhaps unintended consequences with people with disabilities and so forth. So I think that's wonderful, and just want to say thank you. I think this has been it appears that this has been a very thoughtful, deliberative process, a lot of detail, a lot of good information, and I really would like to hear more from the Institute for the Built Environment and the role of land use planning and smart growth and all of those kinds of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, we're out of time. I had some questions, but I don't think there's time for my questions now. So I guess we'll try to maybe see if I can talk to you all offline and ask my questions. But I want to reiterate, I just think this is an excellent presentation. I appreciate the approach and the how it was laid out, and I'm just really excited. It really resonated with me. But one question for the parking lot is, I know county's taking responsibility for some of these things, but just like with the air quality, we partnered with City of Fort Collins to address that. I don't know if I saw that, but where there are opportunities for us to partner with our municipalities, I don't want to highlight those so we can maybe start looking at some of those partnerships, and even with some of our other more rural areas, how we can look to help them and look as a partner trying to work together on these. So I didn't know where we can look at that. I'm just going to see if Lorenda wanted to add anything, and then I just want to thank you. It's just an excellent presentation. I really appreciate you all three being here today, and really excited about this work. It just really coming in my mind together, and I appreciate the partnerships and the work from all the folks involved with this process. I can't thank them enough for their engagement.
The only thing I'll add is that the timing is perfect on this with your strategic plan. And so some of these elements tie to many of the things that the community leaders pointed out. And so we will look to coordinate these two plans so they're not working in parallel, but really it's the same effort, the same plan, maybe even the same team.
Great. Well, with that, just in the interest of time, again, thank you all for being here today. At 10:59, we are adjourned. Thank you.